Right.
Okay, welcome to UTOKing with Gregg. I'm here with Robert Ryan, a professor who I've had a couple of really interesting conversations with. He popped up on Alexander Bard's list. I listened to him talk on the Jim Rutt show. And then I had the good fortune for us to develop a private conversation. And quite frankly, I've been chewing on his ideas ever since we had that. So it's really wonderful to have you here. I look forward. We've agreed in advance that Robert's going to sort of dive in and give us a strong argument for what he's working on. Let me set you up for this listeners in relationship to why I'm really excited about hearing this. Okay. So those of you following my work carefully know, obviously, I'm totally embedded in the field of psychology. Okay. And that field of psychology, then as it attaches to the natural sciences and then moves into the human sciences and anthropology, and then jumps over to applied disciplines in psychotherapeutics. That's the center. And the unified UTOK is all about affording consilience between natural science, psychology, and philosophy. However, or in addition, there's this whole relationship to the social sciences, okay? And how we shift into cultural anthropology on the one hand, and then shift into sociology, economics, political science, and the macroscopic systems of industry and technology and justifications and how all that shit works, which I'm kind of clueless about. But we have an expert here today to help us out. Robert, welcome. Thanks so much for coming along.
It'll be fun. Thanks. Yeah. So just to riff off what you just said, first of all, I'm a professor, assistant professor at Clayton State University, which is in the Atlanta area in Georgia. And I teach entrepreneurship, business strategy. I'm developing a course for this spring, which is called Video Games, Virtual Worlds, and AR, VR. Cool. This is the number one, kind of hot entrepreneurship area for the next decade. So I think it's appropriate to kind of give them a course specifically on those technologies,
totally,
so they can examine those opportunities. And but before I became a business professor, I also I had a master's in economics. I also had an MBA, but basically I did a dual master's program at University of Delaware. Well, to be honest, what happened is I had to skip out on the thesis for the econ. So technically it ended up becoming like a concentration or something, but I had accepted to a PhD program. So I had to split. I'm like, my ego does not require that it actually officially says master's. So
right.
Whatever. But then before that, I also did international relations and anthropology in my undergrad. So I have sort of and all along I've been doing work with philosophy and sociology and so forth. So I developed a sort of encyclopedic view of the social sciences. And even though I would say psychology isn't my strongest suit, I also have a PhD minor in organizational learning and human cognition.
Oh, well, there's a bridge. We can certainly plug into that world.
Little psychology. And
I know you know a lot about Herb Simon and decision making and all of that satisfying good stuff.
Yeah, and so I'm glad you brought that up because really one way to frame this is when you go through an academic journey, you pick up schools of thought, not just fields. So, for example, economics doesn't mean anything to an economist when you just say, "Oh, you're an economist." And they're like, "And like what kind?"
Totally.
It's like saying you like football. Okay, but what team do you follow?
Right. And you mean soccer in Europe, or you mean actual American football?
Right.
So that level of differentiation is possible. Yeah.
Right. Whereas I am an Atlanta FC United supporter, so I'm.
Oh, okay. There you go.
Well, it's the biggest soccer market in the United States. So brand new team though. They've only been around for a few years. But anyway, but yeah. So like when you say you're an economist, wait, are you a Keynesian? Are you an Austrian or a Neo-Austrian? What are you? Right.
Right.
And 90% of economists are in the mainstream, but even within the mainstream, there's fragments. So, for example, Paul Krugman was one of the guys who really made economic geography important. mainstream economics. And before Paul Krugman, a lot of people had said, well, that was a subfield that's over here and it's of special interest for special stuff. Like if you're studying civilizations or something, cities and things like that, you need to do geographic analysis. But it didn't become mainstream until Krugman started pointing out that, geographic issues in trade were essential and things like that. So long story short, like over the years, the various different heterodoxies get folded back into the mainstream and it swallows it back in. Yep. And so economics has been on this tear of trying to do that. But a lot of the other social sciences are behind in terms of folding those things back in. So we have this huge explosion of heterodoxies in all these social sciences.
Agree.
And the further you're away from mathematical proof as you're centering principles for social science, the greater the scatterings are and fragmentations. And so, I'm seeing a lot of the same problems that you're seeing in psychology across many of the other areas. And again, I want to mention that psychology is so big. I believe it's roughly equivalent in size of economics in terms of research publication, but in terms of practitioners, you're more than 10 times the size.
Clearly, yes, that's a practitioner. And that's actually a really interesting just history to know. Psychology, certainly in the, Britain into the United States, German and Russian and others, a little different. Psychology means all these different things, but the empirical discipline of it then becomes an experimental enterprise off the Enlightenment. And the primary founders are trying to build the academic practice and are seen as some kind of research discipline that comes off of biology. That's generally where most people are placing it. But then in the 1940s and 50s, especially after World War II, you get a massive infusion from the government to help with adjustment, post-war adjustment. So they pour all this money into clinical psychology. And then we see in the back half of the 20th century that explodes, and not even in psychology, counseling, therapy, all over. You get the entire mental health cottage industry, and you multiply it out that way. And it's just an unbelievable industry at that level.
Right. And so even today, you still have journals of psychotherapy, of journals of humanist psychology, of Buddhist psychology, of, integral psychology, of, and some of these schools don't get along so well with each other. And it's interesting, however, that I wanted to point out before I launch into my pitch, it seems like sometimes the most bitter rivals are among those meta schools or those who claim to have some sort of meta status, where we're saying, "Oh, we're the home base field. The rest of you guys are doing subfield stuff." And so, for example, one of the smallest but most fierce subfields that's making claims to be meta is integral psychology, and it's interesting when you in this space, it seems so obvious to people who are integral involved, where they say, can't you tell that we're at the center of what counts as meta or integrated or what, So your world is so small that you're not aware of how small it appears to the mainstream or to those who are not with you on that. Right. And so you're walking into that same kind of scenario where the people who have encountered you and had conversations with you seem to be, it's like, why can't everybody else see what we're doing? And it's you're kind of going through the same growing pains as integral as being, but then there's also this potential rivalry there too. What do you think of that?
Well, that's really interesting. Integral actually inside of academic psychology, nobody knows anything about integral. Integral is basically given no credibility inside of. I was a well-trained psychologist when I produced my 2003 article. You'll see I don't cite Ken Wilber in the 2003 article because I barely heard of the guy and had no idea what he was talking about. Okay, so then I learned in 2003-4, somebody pointed out, I was like, there's an integral that's all this claims to be kind of a unified psychology. In fact, Ken put out integral psychology very close at the same time. Then I was like, oh, God, I probably should have cited this guy. Then I entered into the world of integral. And my initial reaction, because I'm trained as a naturalist behavioral scientist, is, actually, that drops into spiritualism. So that's kind of woo. No wonder we don't pay any attention. I was fairly critical of it. Okay. Over the time, that's totally changed. And in fact, my current book, especially, it's changed on a number of things that I don't need to get into here, but I'm much more affiliative. I connect with Layman Pascal and Bruce Alderman, who are sort of post-integral stage guys who I think are unbelievably brilliant. I really love the bridge between Roy Bhaskaar's critical realism and integral. They did some wonderful things along those lines. I totally see UTOK as in that ballpark, and I see this is the age of integrated pluralism. So it's the age of big ideas that are going to transcend this competition to be the one true ring, okay, but actually creates a weave around an integrated pluralistic structure across a wide variety of different domains. If we get that right, that's complicated, but if we get that right, I think that's a whole new kind of way of being and way of relating ideas together. So in that sentiment and sensibility, I'm very much positively inclined towards integral and see a lot of overlap, and I'm clear about the differences too. But I think they're more complementary than they are competitive.
Yeah, and that's interesting because that leads into our conversation where we're talking about big models that have potential to be to have high complementarity to each other. And what I keep saying to my friends is that that's only possible if you focus on interoperability in the way that you design your theories. And, if you're trained in the mainstream, if that's grilled into your head is that every advance that you make has to have very careful extensions and connections to everything else that's been validated so far. And so, we're very incremental in mainstream work when we do that. But then when we get outside of that, then we often find that it's a zoo of people who are all very, very sure of their own models and very rivalrous about others and have a lot of strong emotions about what the mainstream did to them or what other schools of thought that they have rivalry with and so forth.
Sure.
And having been through that myself and seen that pattern happen over and over again in many spaces, I've seen it in many different fields. There's sort of like a field level dynamic where paradigms are shifting, Totally. So you and I can both relate to the Kuhnian paradigm shift conversation. And basically, some paradigms are sort of implicit where it's like, well, we're doing relativity theory, it's a grab bag of equations that we all agree on, and it has these implications, but wasn't written like, here's the paradigm, here's the book, relativity chapters, volume 1 through 5. It really wasn't put together like a formal encyclopedia of relativism, but people like you and I think that's kind of a drawback, and that we were in a period from 1940 to 2020, were basically like a postmodern culture period. And there's an overlap between that and what I call the empirical science, big science period, which was 1900 to 1980-ish roughly. And so it was at peak relativism between 40 and 80 when you have radical empiricism overlapping with relativism after World War II. Okay. And we're kind of flipping to the opposite right now, where we're saying, we've done that. We used that as our research paradigm for a long period of time to do lots of little specific things. Robert Merton kind of started that. One of those people who basically said, science shall be middle range and no higher. We don't do grand models. We don't do big integrative texts. And this was because it was all the rage to do that during modernity period of culture, 1860 to 1940. Everyone was looking for big stage models, big grand models, big everything. And the rivals were bitter between these models. And it was like Herbert Spencer says, everything is evolution. And then if you would disagree with him, then he'll go to war against you.
Totally.
Don't go up against Anna Freud of the APA. You just can't do it. And then it was like John Maynard Keynes became... you couldn't get a paper published in a journal unless it gave some sort of lip service to his theory, and so after we had that era, it's understanding we had this reaction where everything was decentralized and kind of incremental, but also scattered. And so after doing that for a while, we've got this massive mound of research, and somebody's got to dig through these trash heaps, We
call them graduate students.
Right. Yeah. Right. And so we got to dig through all these trash heaps, and we got to reverse this process and synthesize. So the 2020s are all about synthesis. So we're right here on pace in terms of these historical rhythms. And that means that we're looking at a paradigm shift.
Love it.
Moving from what, again, like I said, 1980 is the rough date where you would say complexity science really was being formalized and as a thing, rather than as a few scattered ideas like cellular automata and chaos and so forth. And so in the 80s that things started to coalesce. And so I look at scientific paradigm shifts as being roughly every 80 years.
Okay.
And so, but they're kind of skewed to the back end. So it's like you have this long curve where you have this stable paradigm stuff that we're very confident in, but you've got this big barbarian horde of like other ideas, like slowly accumulating and putting pressure. And then right around 40 to 60 years out, there's a kind of big swing towards the barbarians who then, as Ibn Khaldun said in the 12th century, basically you have this cycle of the civilizations always being overtaken by the barbarians. And that's true in science. So barbarians now. The
barbarians at the gate.
Yes. The complexity thinkers and the synthesis integralists, basically the people who want to take all of our information, reorganize it, condense it, make better encyclopedias, reset the textbooks. We've been doing these incremental generations on textbooks where it's like, we're on the 9th edition of the textbook that was written 60 years ago. And it's like, okay, let's go back to the first edition of the first version that uses complexity in chapter 1.
Right. Nice.
Right.
Yeah. Love it. Yeah. Very good.
And so we're looking at doing a scientific reset on complexity from chapter 1, and also on grand thinking again, where we're going to say, you know what? We do need to give some students some grand models that they can work with so they can put all of these things into a framework and then continue to have a kind of like having a Dewey Decimal System in your head where you can basically keep it all together and be very individual learner friendly. And also, so you feel there's a cumulativeness to your learning that isn't so damn messy.
Totally. That's really nicely said. In fact, I've had a number of people saying, Greg, you were born in the wrong century. You should have been born 100 years ago in the context of meta models and all, Hegel and the like, from Spencer and Hegel and all of that. The nice thing is that, there's all sorts of different domains in the competition of the meta models, and then that disperses. And now that's exactly right. So I love the cyclical framing that we've got going on. And that's certainly all of a sudden now it feels, especially on the heels of COVID, there's an accelerating process of things aren't right. And we need sense-making tools across a wide variety of different domains. And we got to work together quickly to construct them. At least that's the sensibility that I'm picking up across a wide variety of different domains. So there really does feel like this is a decade that is fundamentally shifting their basic needs for sense making, and that pendulum is swinging the other way.
And so let me give you a prognosis of what's going on here. So basically, I will start at the now, and then I'm going to go back to the model and say, where did I get this?
Okay. All right, perfect.
Right. Yep. So we can get a little bit of a hook.
That's always good. Business people tell me that's a good thing.
Right. Let me give you the point first. Yeah, exactly. It's like I got to grab your attention before I justify myself.
Perfect.
So, how do we know where we are in history, and why are there people claiming to know that? So we have a subculture of futurism, and a lot of people think they're a woo-woo, arcane, or flaky, or
read the tea leaves.
Exactly, like parapsychology kind of stuff, where it's like, so anyway, how can you possibly know the future, right? Well, the thing is, most people don't know that the social sciences are much more advanced than they were even like 20, 30 years ago. But that the social sciences really do give you abilities to predict the future in some rather objective ways that might surprise people to know how good they are.
Right.
Sort of like, can we predict a hurricane, that kind of thing. So it's really all about cycles and how many intervals we've seen. And so when you start to see a really strong pattern in history, the predictions strengthen. So I'm going to just give you some quick comments about the moment.
Okay.
So where are we in history? Well, the first way to answer that question is you have to know what the harmonics are, right? You've got to have some sort of like basic harmonics. Sorry about that. I was interrupted by a call. Okay. So what are the harmonics? So you got to start there. Well, clearly we know the economy, right? So the economy has a boom and a bust cycle, and that's a biggie, right? So we got a whole field of macroeconomics devoted to understanding are we up or down, and why and when, and then what all the consequences are. Well, where are we now there? Okay. So we are in what's known as, we're at the maturity point of the fifth techno-economic paradigm since the first industrial revolution.
Okay.
And at that maturity point, we have the upswing or the emergence of the sixth paradigm. Okay. And so some people are confused as to whether or not the technology in question is a fifth or a sixth paradigm. Is it mature? And the answer is it mature or emerging? And so you'll hear people say things like, augmented reality, industry 4.0. And say, well, I see some people calling industry 4.0 the fourth industrial revolution. What if they're wrong? Okay. So what if they don't have the correct number of revolutions, first of all? Then they're going to be off on their harmonics and they're going to be making bad predictions. Second of all, what if the thing that they identified isn't even a revolution? Okay. So just as a quick example, Industry 4.0, in my perspective, is the maturation phase of the fifth industrial paradigm, aka the digital paradigm.
Okay.
If you know that, and somebody tells you it's a revolution, you could make a heck of a lot of money by betting against their assumptions about where these things go and forecast.
Okay.
So, for example, it's a very important financial difference for a business as to whether or not this is the maturation phase where you're going to be mature industry strategy centered around those technologies, or whether or not you're going to be practicing a different pattern of strategy centered around emergence and growth.
Right.
And so diagnosing which side of this you're on and which technologies are on what is extremely important.
Makes perfect sense.
So we're at that cusp where everyone's confused.
I'll vouch for that.
Right. And so that's natural, because whenever you hit the basically the, you have a inflection point when things taking off in an S curve. And then when you hit, when things kind of pass that curve the other direction and you hit maturity, people often think that it's going to bounce back up again. Right. And you're going to go skyrocketing off in progress. But you may actually be flattening sharply.
Flattening down, definitely.
Railroads, for example, went through that, where there was people were betting on railroads to go off into infinity right up until the point that it happened. And then all the great railroad companies hit the wall. Bam. Steel, same thing happened. They were just predicting that the steel boom would go on forever. And then basically they hit the inflection wall so fast, it put off like 1/3 of the companies out of business, huge consolidation. And so this is a very common mistake made, is knowing where you are there. Okay? Right. So before I go on to the next point, do you have any questions about that?
Well, I don't know if people know much, and I'm no expert, but there's things called Fourier Transforms, which are basically the way in which you assess waves and harmonic oscillations. So you do it in physics and other kinds of things. And so what I'm hearing you is just sort of laying out social science wave kind of formulations and understanding crests, valleys, and peaks, and knowing what line you're trying to look at and articulating that. And the difference then of predicting whether that thing's coming down or going up is to get key on the right ontological line that we're talking about and its intersection with other lines. And so I think that's what I'm sensing you're laying out here.
That's right. And so basically, if you have the wrong units of analysis, you're going to make the wrong bet. So if everybody's betting on one unit and they're saying, I know we've had this trend going along a long way, it's because of this X variable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It turns out that trend was actually, from variable Y. And when you hit that divergence point, that's when you find out you were measuring it wrong. And so they were going the same direction for so long and you didn't spot the divergence.
Nice. Mm-hmm.
And so that's always the mystery is, am I measuring this right? And do I even know what the wave is? Because that's the problem is like, we'll draw these waves and we'll say, here's the economy and it's booming. And they said, what's your variable? Okay, GDP. Okay. What's the real economy underneath that? What is that a proxy for really?
Mm-hmm,
and so if you get that wrong, you'll make the prediction wrong as to whether or not GDP is going to keep going up or not.
Right.
You got your proxies wrong. So for example, financial crisis, basically that was a game of measuring all wrong proxies. So basically it's like everything's going up together. You can't tell what's driving this. And it all seems to be perpetual motion machine, And then all of a sudden they realized that everything's being basically there was a shelving
stacked on a bubble,
dark pool money that made it all an illusion. And we were measuring the wrong stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And so like the numbers were lying to us. And so this is always the case whenever you hit like these kind of like big paradigm shifts, is that there's your key. During a paradigm shift, the units of analysis themselves that you should be paying attention to are shifting.
Gotcha.
In a macro system. So
basically
it's like you've been chasing Moore's law, but now all of a sudden Moore's law is not your primary driver. And you're like, holy hell, how'd that happen?
Right.
Okay. So you may then ask the question, what are the primary drivers of the fifth paradigm versus the sixth paradigm?
Brilliant. Okay.
Right?
I wish I asked that question. No, go ahead. Let's ask that question.
Well, you can if you want, but I think
I think you just set it up. So that's brilliant. Makes my job easy.
So basically the digital paradigm is driven by Moore's law. But here's the thing. Moore's law is not necessarily what people think it is. Moore's law is not just simply the outcome. Okay, the outcome is like this constant reduction in scale and this constant reduction in number of transistors on a space and so forth. But the cause of that outcome is actually the underlying scientific instruments and the productive technologies that are able to produce ever smaller nanometer, lithography. And so it's obvious that when those productive techniques hit the
wall or the down curve,
right, that we have an early warning sign that we're about to run out of a leash there. And here's something that many people don't discuss publicly these days. It kind of blows my mind, but it was already determined back in roughly 2005, 2006 that cost and benefits are no longer both going up exponentially, basically for Moore's law.
Right.
So for a good period of time, every generation of computer would come out not only better, but also cheaper. In other words, the actual cost of production kept going down.
Right.
Okay. So thing is that stopped a while ago and it reversed, which means that the cost of production has been going up for every generation of improvement since 2006.
Interesting. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
And that the only way that they've been able to continue to sort of, I don't know. I will tell you Moore's law is not as aggressive as it was, but they were able to fudge it for a while. It's by doing really clever multi-layer stuff where basically, they're like, well, we're going to be printing in deeper 3D structures that we can keep squeezing more efficiency out there instead of making them smaller or thinner. Because you run out of, molecules to shave. Okay. I mean, I do believe that our nanometers, the scale of our transistors are smaller than the COVID-19 virus.
Is that where it is these days? Huh.
Well, in terms of the frontier, yeah.
Okay.
Basically,
that's fascinating.
And I don't mean the whole object. I just mean the scale at which the cuts are happening.
Right.
So basically, so anyway, we're talking about a nanoscale where basically we've run out of ability to get those results. And so now we should have a paradigm shift into quantum. And to do that, quantum uses it has to use organic chemistry. And what they're doing is they're doing manufacturing on the scale of singular molecules now. So that they can basically create these like single molecule fields that excite and do these quantum behaviors much more efficiently than the early the early quantums were just tinker toys, but so quantum is now supreme, and that just happened in the past 2 years where we have proof under specific conditions they were able to squeeze that performance out. It's not cost effective there yet.
Right.
But the point is that cost is going down exponentially and the performance is overtaking. And so we're going to have a quantum trajectory which passes. However, this only works for annealing type and basically quantum type algorithms. So it doesn't work for all algorithms. But guess what algorithms it's specifically good for? Complexity. Hey. Specifically. And so this tells us that, hey, we actually understand stuff. We know that the complexity science paradigm is being backed by a complexity engine, which means that we are the scientific paradigm of complexity is approaching the mature phase, whereas the economy that would be derived from those learnings are in the emergence phase.
Interesting.
So we have that trajectory, but we also have the trajectory of solar, which also hit that magic point years ago. Solar Sunshot 2030 was a program the U.S. put together to accelerate the solar process, and it worked. We spent an extra couple $2 billion a year on solar, and we were able to accelerate solar research so fast that they were basically saying, don't give us any more money because we got to put it onto the applied research because that's the bigger bottleneck is the batteries and the network and so forth. And so that's why we're trying to raise a ton of money now for the infrastructure, because that's going to be necessary to carry forth that innovation. So in the basic model here, you have motive branch technology, which the motive is the engine. Okay. So like either information or energy. So solar is an energy engine, whereas quantum computing is an information engine.
Totally. Yep.
So those are the motive branches. They are the first branches of technology in a paradigm shift when we go into a new.
Which, by the way, in terms of the ontic base of TOK, those are the best two concepts: energy and information.
Yeah. And that's,
so anyway,
that's consistent across Daniel Schmachtenberger's work, my work. Many people in the bioeconomics field are also saying those are the two primary units of analysis.
Yep.
And so at the most abstract level, everything should touch those, either information or energy as a unit analysis. So that drives the paradigm shift, right? So the science very clearly leads it, right? And so that drives the paradigm shift. And then you go from motive to what we call the carrier branch. And the carrier branch is also called the, complex products.
Okay.
So, for example, automobiles, personal computers,
The shit people can use to transfer energy and information to what they want.
Right. The complex products that were not possible before, but once the paradigm shifted, it became a sudden center product of that paradigm. So in the fourth one, it was automobiles was one of them in the fourth, including airplanes. So those are the form factors that drive those new energy and information gains, right?
Right.
And then they create complex industry clusters around which Silicon Valley pops up, or Detroit in the fourth paradigm, or so there's always these center clusters in different parts of the world.
Right.
Okay. And so in other words, I'm not going to go any much deeper into that at the moment, but that is called the techno-economic paradigm. We can date, I can go all the way back to the beginning of civilization, but the strongest dates are from the first industrial revolution forward in terms of the wave harmonics, the patterns, the structures, motive, carrier, infrastructure, services.
Beautiful.
That's the order.
Love
motive,
it.
carrier, infrastructure, services, and it's parallel to levels of like hardware to software stack.
Yep. All right. So let me just plug that in. All right. So this is exactly the kind of architecture from a UTOK perspective we need, meaning that UTOK basically with its TOK, it doesn't really pick up artificial technological assemblages. Okay. It doesn't really say much about those. It punts on that stuff, right? But then there's this interface between human behavior, human justification, the earth, and the behavior patterns that all systems across energy information layer in is engaged in. And then we build these technological structures to create energy information flow. And then that's going to create the organization of human industries and structures. And so now what you're saying, just adding to that through that angle of expertise is like, oh, well, that's the whole sort of techno-social add-on that has emerged as a function of civilization in relation. And that's just like a Lego block, at least from my self-centered perspective, where it was like, that's the goddamn social science Lego blockage that we need to understand this aspect of the sets of equation, which in some ways is sort of the most macro important. It's like, what the fuck's actually happening up here? Yeah. So anyway, it's brilliantly stated and very clear and very exciting. And thank you.
So that example gives you an idea of one of the macro waves of history that's of highest importance to us. So let me flash back. So now here's my elevator speech. I have a theory called World Systems Theory 3.0. And we could name it different things, but I figured that it's always better to frame something in perspective of the closest thing like it. And so, for example, your universal theory of knowledge was originally framed as a psychology theory, even though it's actually a universal theory of knowledge, right? In the same sense, my theory is framed as a general social science theory, but it was framed and developed from international relations theory. And why international relations theory? Because it is the granddaddy of macro. Okay. And the thing is that everybody else but them doesn't know that. like everybody else but them. Like if you've never had that education in international relations, it's kind of niche. You think that sociology controls the grand, or you might think that macroeconomics controls grand or anthropology, whatever it is. So all these fields kind of think they control it. The reason why international relations controls grand social theory is that it's like the second oldest social science to history. Okay, first of all. Right. Originally, all we had for macro at 3000 BC was astronomy.
Yeah.
Basically, we didn't have economics. So basically, we had astronomy, history, and politics. And foreign policy was the highest order level of that problem. So going back to Rome.
Very interesting.
Right. So what's the oldest book? Do you know what this was? This is the oldest book in human history that we have in complete form, and that was in constant circulation all the way up to today. Most people guessed it would probably be the Bible.
Yeah, that's what that is where I went. But that obviously I know that's wrong. So no, go ahead. I don't know what the answer is.
Right. So it is the teachings of Amenhotep. Huh. And the teachings of Amenhotep is a Egyptian book dated roughly around 3200 BC. And it is it was a set of learnings, sayings, wise teachings of Amenhotep was a vizier, and he wrote this basically life guide for bureaucrats in the Egyptian Empire. And the hilarious part is everyone thinks bureaucracy was invented in the 1800s with corporations. And so like you'll see all these models that like paint the 1800s forward as the bureaucratic period. Even Max Weber kind of talked like that, you know, with the growth of bureaucracy and so forth. Well, it's hilarious because the oldest book we have in human circulation is a book about bureaucracy and how to survive that lifestyle as a young man. It was basically written.
I didn't know that. Holy shit.
It's a training manual for young men who wanted to get into the bureaucratic life, and they had to learn all the wise teachings.
Wow.
Now, this is so old. We're talking 3,000 years before the Chinese history was officially recorded in the 300 BC when they first started recording its official history. And the Greeks in, you know, a few hundred years before that. So you're talking 3,000 years before them. You have a book of, so what are those sayings, right? They're they're a lot of the same kinds of sayings and teachings that you see in like Confucianism, that you see in, you know, like, it's a whole lot of like middle path stuff, like, you know, have fun, but not too much fun, you know, treat your wife well, but don't let her push you around,
right?
You know, be good to your kids, but like, don't be so obsessed with them that you're not at work all the time, you know,
moderate, the golden path of moderation, that kind of thing. Huh?
It's a handbook for the middle class.
Fascinating.
Okay? It's and the middle path, you know, is always about the middle class, because the middle class has to stand in the middle of all things and basically be professional and hold the world together by reinforcing the bureaucracy. So if human behavior has been standardized in the bureaucratic format all the way back since the dawn of civilization.
That's amazing. I love this. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then we have continuity in our cognition of how to live in such a world. Also today, we have institutions designed to manage similar problems like the flooding of the Nile and all this other stuff. We talk about, you know, the Holland, and they have built these great water dikes and everything to manage the water system. And that's a wonder of the world. If they were doing that, trying to manage the floods in Egypt all the way back then. So you had need of bureaucracy to manage this stuff. So the point is, like, you have all these big infrastructural systems that from the very beginning were there to manage risk.
Yeah.
There to manage, you know, planning for the future, long-term, trying to create stability. And everybody knows eventually you're going to be hit by a swarm of locusts or whatever. And you got to, the better your forecasts, you know, the better. So we had a bureaucratic society running on long-term forecasts for 5,000 years at least. Okay. In great civilizations. And so you have this structure for a world system to spring out of the central bureaucracies of the world that plan and coordinate our lives to a much greater degree than the little people think.
Right.
And the people who know about this are the upper class, and they control international relations. So this is an education for the elite. Okay. Philosophy, history, and politics, both domestic and foreign being international. These were educations for the elite, and less than 1% of people needed to have the access according to their thinking. Well, the thing is now, put it, you know, in reflection, you know, you look at what CEOs do, what government leaders, people in high places do. What they're doing is more like what the ancient Egyptians were doing than what you and I do. In other words, they're trying to forecast cycles just like the Egyptians. And so there's like this whole misunderstanding among the public that the world is like completely out of control. It's controlled by people like Donald Trump. It's not like it's a total mess. It's total cacophony. Nobody has any idea how anything's working. It's just like dog eat dog entrepreneurialism and all this stuff. Well, no, in the upper class, everything is so planned. It's unbelievable. It's plans on top of plans on top of plans. And you know, the highest paid management consulting firms are doing cyclical forecasts and doing them better. And so they all have proprietary models of how they can predict 50 years in advance. And so there's this whole culture in the upper class and in senior management of studying everything in terms of like these institutional structures and cycles and phases and periods. And then they deny it publicly, and you'll never hear it on the news. You'll never hear it on CNN, or you'll never hear it on even like Bloomberg will never tell you about business cycles that everybody is using to run companies. They will deny it, and they will say it's this big open, you know, neoclassical market, and we're all just reacting to market signals, and that's not what's happening at all.
Fascinating.
You know, and so world systems theory 3.0 basically says that since the dawn of civilization, we've had continuity in terms of our big structures, governments, businesses, and so international relations is a field that basically tells you about this. You have these basic models of how the world operates, and you can predict. And so one of those big models is called world systems theory.
All right.
And world systems theory is the most obsessed with cycles. And so they try to predict rhythms and phases of world changes that are inevitable, and there's nothing you can do about them. Okay. So for example, the rise.
Is this World Systems 1.0? Is that what you're now referring to? Okay.
Yeah, like the rise of China, or like the rise of, you know, a new hegemon. So when you hear everyone, hegemon is the most powerful nation during a period. And so the original world systems theory focused on hegemonic theory. And so if you took it in IR class, you were learning that there are these intervals by which the centers of power in the world system shift, such as, you know, there was a period. We basically would start from Italy and say, you know, the Venice Genoa period, and then after that, you basically had like a Spanish period and Portuguese period. So then it really takes off when you basically have the Dutch, and because with the Dutch. You have the beginnings of the stock market and the open world trade and so forth.
Right. Dutch Indies whole trade system makes open.
Right. And so all the civilizations become connected over that period. And so then you basically go from a loosely connected kind of regional system, you know, like, I mean, clearly like the Americas were connected through the Incas and the Aztecs. You had, you know, Asia was pretty well connected by the Silk Road, but these are kind of regional connections. But these things folded up into a world level connection after the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, Dutch dominance, and then the British really put it on steroids. And so basically from that period forward, all of the institutions of the world start falling into a cadence. Okay. So in prior periods, the rhythms were kind of regional or local. So it'd be like there's the East Asian cadences, and Chinese history was written that way. It was like, look, when we're in this phase, this happens. And then we're in that phase, that happens. The Indians had a cyclical history that they lived off of. The Egyptians did. The Westerners tried to move away from it. They were using it during the Middle Ages and all this other stuff. But they thought that progress meant the end of
now we got transcendent reason, and we can just take this
right, you know,
line up
this and off the map, you know, like the cycles don't exist anymore. So everyone said with like the first industrial revolution and the huge inflection point of population and information explosion and all that, they were like, we have totally gone off the map of history. We are no longer in that cyclical history. You know, we have escaped. And so escape velocity, right?
Escape velocity. That's what I was thinking. Yeah.
Right. So basically they think they got escape velocity around the first industrial revolution, which was like 1770s period. And so, but what happens is that from that period on, there is a shift or a difference in the cadence, and a greater synchronicity through the world as a whole. But basically, like everyone kept trying to predict the end of history. You know, they thought World War II was the end of history as we knew it, and we were off the map and so forth. The funny thing is, right after World War II, a lot of the cycles returned that we thought, you know, were disrupted by the war.
Okay.
And so, like, the Marxists started predicting that they were like, watch, there's profit cycles, and eventually the socialist revolution is going to happen because we're, you know, we're coming back to like we're proving that the system is ultimately crashy. And so it's going to collapse back into ancient history, basically.
Gotcha.
And so like the pessimists are saying, you know, there's no cycles here. It's just going to be collapse. And then the optimists are saying there's no cycles anywhere. You're crazy. You know, it's too complex. And then so there was a very small group of people who were still kind of using the wave perspective and saying, you know, it's always worked in the past. I'm going to bet that it's going to work in the future.
All right.
Lo and behold, turned out that we had done manipulations of the markets that had never happened in world history, such as like the FDIC.
Okay.
Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, that basically tried to like stabilize banks in a way that had never existed before. So once we started stabilizing banks in various ways, bank cycles flattened. And bank cycles were a big part, you know, the financial cycles were a big part of what the Austrians were saying was causing all the problem.
Okay.
Well, they were denying that the Federal Reserve System could stabilize that. But then when we did, they were like, well, that surprised me. I didn't see that coming. The Austrians had always been studying the cycles and saying these are here. And so everyone said Austrian cycles are dead. You know, Keynesian, you know, economics has fixed that. We've stabilized the economy. And then we keep getting, you know, subtle cycles in the bank system. And then occasionally these big, like, financial crises keep happening. And we're like, oh shit. So you mean the waves are still with us? Like people predicted the financial crisis with waves, you know? And so long story short, that's more proof that we actually do know what causes the waves. It's the same stuff that we thought it was before. It's the actual structure of the international system.
Okay.
The planning system of large organizations, the formal structures are things that humans built that basically we can't really, they kind of have their life of their own, you know, and we
certain amount of inertia, you set things in motion and then there's a flow of energy information in them that take on a life of their own.
Right. So there's some emergent stuff that happens in formal and large organizations where no one person is big enough to affect the flow of it. And so you get these cycles. And so the point is, my theory is an update of the world systems theory that was started by Emanuel Wallerstein. Okay. And Emanuel Wallerstein based everything around the Treaty of Westphalia, the Dutch, and then forward.
Okay.
Okay. And he also focused.
And that's World System 1.0? Is that right? Okay.
Right. And he had a mission of uniting the social sciences around a new perspective and a new canon. And so he would write alternating books for international relations and books for the general social science crowd and saying, here's my theory for IR. And here's my claim to everybody else. Everybody should be reading IR. It's the true godfather of the social sciences, but
really
only the elites have been using it. And so basically, you know, it was very Neo-Schumpeterian. He went back to what's also known as the chondritive wave, which is chondritive waves are these big, long economic cycles on the world level. So it's world level booms and busts.
Okay.
And so Schumpeter was aware of that and used it in his model. He was a rival of Keynes. Keynes was saying we can end all these cycles. Schumpeter was saying we need to work with them to a certain extent because they're inevitable. And that any attempt to fully squash it will create an opposite reaction that has an unintended consequence. but he wasn't as he wasn't as skeptical as the Austrians, who were just like, keep your hands off completely.
Right.
Schumpeter was like, they used to call him the right-wing Marx.
Yeah, that's interesting. Never heard of that.
But really, he ended up winning because his economics became the lifeblood of large organizations that we use today. It's the center of business school thinking. And so, but really, so Wallerstein was working with trying to put together a grand model and said, here's economics, here's politics, here's the big powers, here's the big economic patterns.
Okay.
And we're going to show that technology and the anticipation of shifts in the centers of technology and the leading technologists will predict shifts in political power. And so it became the leading indicator, where he'd basically say, well, the reason why the British rose to prominence was because of the textile industry, and then the ships, and that became the center of their paradigm. And they became the lead country in the world at the heart of that techno-economic paradigm, which then led them to be the lead political institution on the back of that. So the Wallerstein perspective is, since the first industrial revolution, we've been living in a tech dominant world.
Okay.
So we always have these leading arguments that technology drives the locus of power politically.
Okay.
Although there are phase shifts, and so it's messy and so forth. And so the argument there would be China couldn't take us over unless they truly became the center of lead technology.
Okay.
Right. And so that prediction has held consistent since the 1600s. And so we have yet to see a country be a true number one power that wasn't the number one in military tech and the number one in production tech.
Gotcha.
Okay? So you can't just simply have ideas, man. You've got to
really? Fuck.
Yeah.
That's bad news for me, dude.
So that was 1.0, is that those two basic levels, although he did postulate the third level of culture or social, didn't do much work on it. World Systems Theory 2.0, Andre Gunther Frank. This guy speaks 8 languages. He's been in.
I never heard of this guy until you mentioned him. I think last time we talked.
He's kind of like a Herbert Simon character of a quirky heterodoxy.
Okay, interesting.
Where he was like the super genius who spoke everybody's languages, and he had held appointments in half a dozen different sides of universities, history, geography, economic. He did a full tour. He's one of the rare people who actually did a full tour and holding posts in half a dozen different fields.
Wow. Say his name again, just so people hear it.
Andre Gunther Frank. Frank, Frank.
Yep.
And he was a bit of an unknown because he came out of Argentina, I believe, originally. And he was the number one public intellectual for a hot second before he had to flee the regime because his ideas were threatening to the political order. And so then he went to Europe and bounced around and did a lot of stuff. But basically, he just traveled the world. He lectured at 18 different universities and spoke in 8 different languages.
Amazing.
It's just one of these crazy,
unbelievable. Unbelievable.
And so he picks up Wallerstein's work and some of this other huge civilization stuff. And he said he reads it all. He's like, I've read all the big civilization books, and I think Wallerstein is onto something. And I think that I can actually do better than he can by taking into consideration the entire world, not just the Western world since 1648.
Wow.
And so he says, let's look at the East and the West. And he wrote a series of books to reorient world systems theory so that it encapsulates all of the regions of the world going back much further.
Wow. Okay.
Only problem is he died. He was working. He was in the middle of the second book of his Power trilogy on this. I mean, he had tons of publications before this, but he was really in the.
This was where he was really focused, and this is coming out.
Yep. And that was about 6 years ago, and he died. And so. Turns out one of my old professors, his name is Robert Denemark at University of Delaware. I went there in my undergrad and my master's level. But I had him for 4 classes for international relations. And I always thought he was one of the coolest guys ever and just quirky genius.
Right.
Turns out he's the most senior living member of world systems theory now because Wallerstein died and Frank died back to back. Wow. And they both left him with the unfinished manuscripts.
Holy shit. No way. Yeah, no, that's intense.
And then he had members die and COVID-19 and all this stuff. And so like, here he is in the middle of all this. And he's like given a Nobel committee appointments for like reviewing the life's work of world systems theory and all this. And right in the middle of this, I give him a call, send him an email, and I'm like, hey, remember me? I'm your old student.
Right.
I've been working on some stuff. And here's what it looks like.
Okay.
And so I sent it to him and he was like, I can't argue against this. He's like, I can't say that I fully understand it yet because I haven't read a whole book. Right. He said, but I really like what you're doing here. And this is fascinating, but I need to get back to you. I'm in the middle of like putting out
the shit he was dealing with. Right. Yeah. But
he basically tentatively gave me the nod and said, do it.
Okay.
And,
fascinating.
And so what I saw was that 2 or 3 structures was not enough grand cycles in terms of economics, politics, and the social as a generic force. And also that we could do much better in tightening the model. There are some things that hadn't been included from other fields. Believe it or not, even the great Dr. Frank overlooked things that we're doing in business, for example, or in economics, because that was his weak spot.
Okay.
So what I saw was that nobody had yet specified a clear model of, the origin point of each one of these waves. Like, what do you mean politics? When did politics start?
Okay.
And what is the thing that's waving? Let's make sure we know our units of analysis really.
I'm a big fan of that, friend.
Right. Because, waves are outcome models where you're just like, okay, so, it's like when you draw a model of like the stock market, but you're predicting outcomes, but you're not actually explaining what's causing those things. That's like a dumb prediction. I'm just like projecting a line. But if you can simulate the outcome, it means you actually understand what's causing it.
Nice.
And to do that, you need the units correct, and you need an internally correct model that produces those waves. And we haven't really gotten there yet.
Okay.
So we had a qualitative explanation and a descriptive model of waves.
Right.
There's like a missing link between them.
Makes sense to me.
Part. And everyone was focusing on just innovations, And so what I saw was this. I said that basically new waves happen as the world complexifies. As we add new technologies, new systems, new infrastructures to the world, we add new harmonics. And that means we have to have a model that assumes that every time we have any like big paradigm shifts or innovations, we're adding variables. And that basically things are getting more complex. And so on the other hand, those variables don't necessarily contradict the older ones.
Right. Okay.
So there's your sort of like transcend and include concept. How does transcend and include work? Well, it means ceteris paribus, I'm adding more variables without killing the old ones.
Yep.
So we are adding layers to our cake. And so if you go back in world history, you see that the original civilizations were monistic forces.
Okay.
Everything was integrated into one structure.
Right. Sort of this nation, religion, governmental state thing that then did its thing.
Right. And so there was no clear division. So like accounting as a business practice was done by priests.
Right.
It was blessed and it was approved by the stars. And so everything was super integral. It was the most integral society we had ever had in world history. Everyone likes to talk about, tribes, like native tribes, and say there's a beauty to how they lived. And then they say civilization is ugly and it's just everything's a mess and it's a cacophony. I said, no, wait, you skipped the part. The earliest civilizations were super organized.
Yep.
Super integrated. Everything had a role. Everything fit like a jigsaw puzzle, and everything was dense and concentrated with meaning. And so every practice, the money itself had signification and value beyond just currency value. Everything meant something. And so, and you had no separation between church and state and so forth.
Gotcha.
Guess what? That's non-dualism. Okay. So we started civilization from the invention of non-dualism. That's my claim. Okay. I haven't heard anyone else put it that way.
That's a new framing on non-dualism that I've heard. So,
right. Yeah. So the creation of non-dualism as a philosophy was the creation of the first civilizations that were non-dual in philosophy. Okay. That's where that came from. It was the idea that everything had its place in harmony. And the oldest structures that still survive from early civilization are like that. Some people might have heard of the water canal system in Bali.
Yep. Okay.
There's this elaborate canal system that goes back to the 8th century. And it has roots as far, we don't even know how far back the origins are, but we know that at least by the 8th century to today, there has been a continuous practice of managing complex water structures for irrigation of the Balinese society. And they use a cyclical calendar. And they have a priesthood. And so it's not like there's this separate group of people who are infrastructure guys who manage, the water system. No, that's actually a priesthood. And they have their own lore and their own mysticism and their own symbols for everything. And they have their own charting and calendaring and and everything has significance. And there's like lower ranking and higher ranking priests at different levels of the irrigation as it goes down the mountain. And so basically it's this integrated non-dualistic philosophy of religion and so whatever. And so when people talk about integral theory, I said, why aren't you talking about this? That these were the origins of non-dualistic or integral concepts, was that we had literal institutional structures that did include all of these things in one place at one time. We forget that because we don't live in such a world. It never happened. But what's happened is that as civilization has run forward, these integrated structures have fragmented into separate power groups. There's been divisions of power and balances of power, and we created those on purpose. Each time that we created a new split, a move away from non-dualism, a move away from radically integrated harmony, each time we did that as a never again response to bad things. Where we said, never again in civilization will we allow this terrible thing to happen. And this is how we're going to prevent that catastrophic risk. Okay. So why did the church and state separate? Well, during the actual age, Bronze Age collapse. Bronze Age collapse, 1,000, 1,200, that kind of
sort of 1177 BC is a famous book that basically captures the 50 years of I think there are 9 different civilizations that actually go down in like 50 years in terms of the Bronze Age. But anyway. Yeah.
So the societies were very integrated, but they were also very aggressive. And they took their kings very literal as gods on earth at that time. And they were very, hidden away from the ordinary people and a priesthood between them and the rest of the world and so forth. So, Wizard of Oz, right? And so basically we had Wizard of Oz societies. And so what happened though was that these priesthoods were basically telling the king that based on historical and astrological signs that they had to constantly fight. And that if they didn't, they would lose. So if you're not winning, you're losing. And so basically there was like very aggressive combat going on and very cult-like explanations for society. And long story short, everything was genocidal. Your cult, okay, it's assimilation to the Borg, okay? The Hittite Empire gave you two options. You either fully assimilate into our Hittite Borg society, or we annihilate you, and there's no third option.
Right.
And so all wars were genocidal during that period. And this was the thing that they realized was the whole problem of non-dualism and integrated societies was that they were Borg-like, that they sound like a utopian solution until you're in it and there's no outside.
Right. Okay. Interesting.
Everything is a tautological trap. And once you build such a world, you can't get out. It's a prismatic gem which there's no weak points. It's so robust. And so basically these societies were so effective as being contained, robust, gem-like structures that they basically were either win or lose. There's no in between. There is no dynamism, you know? And so they had to go down. And so as places like Greece were rebuilding, you had other societies learning the same lesson, Persia, China, and so forth, in their early attempts to be monolithic societies. And so they all, by the end of the actual age, declare a separation of church and state. Okay. So that forces us to spin off a separate institutional paradigm, one for culture and one for politics. Politics centered around power of the city, the military, and central power. And then the culture being the thing that's allowed to sort of go across borders and be more fluid. And so you have religions popping up, religious tolerance within the Persian Empire and places like that. We'll have multiple different religions in future China, for example. You never have a true monolithic religious culture in China. You know, you have Buddhism and
Taoism, Buddhism, Confucianism.
So long story short, this cultural diversity, ethnic diversity was essential for survival. So the original diversity movement was the separation of church and state. And the problem was it was never a complete separation. And so any society from that point on had the dilemma of integrating it back or disintegrating it. Okay. And so as you run history forward from that point on, you now have these phase cycles of integrative and disintegrative social movements where politics and culture become synonymous with each other and when they become separate concepts. Right. So when you have a nationalization wave, it's when you're trying to mobilize a national culture.
Right.
Right. And so that, when you have a separatism movement, you have a separation between political forces and other cultural forces. And so basically, like, we can start modeling these things as waxing and waning relationships. And so now that's a new harmonic that didn't exist before the Bronze Age. Okay.
Gotcha.
So following this same logic, the same thing happened when scientific revolution happened. This is something that wasn't present in world systems theory 1.0 or 2.0. They said, well, you know, scientific is like kind of like this exogenous variable. And then, but in our model, we have technology and politics. And I'm like, what about culture? What about science? So my claim is that science is a separate institutional structure that drives earlier than technology, and techno-economic paradigms are this other thing. So now there's four things.
Okay.
And these things have broken off at these different intervals in history to create these separations. And every time they do, the harmonics get a little different and more complicated. You know, like a 3-wave system is different than a 2 or a 4. Okay. But as the world's structure harmonizes, the waves synchronize. So you have these various different civilizations with these local differences in political cycles and technology cycles and so forth. And then as these things become globalized, after the great, globalization events, you see a greater harmony. It's even easier to predict. The waves get even more stable. So they're getting stronger and more stable over time. And so in our era, they're even stronger than they were 500 years ago.
All right.
Okay. So, long story short, World Systems Theory 3.0 then is a 4-layer model. And I do not claim we stop there. We can keep going as whatever level of detail we want to go to.
Okay.
But no fewer than 4, because these were the most important wave events that created new institutional structures that then carry these waves forward permanently.
All right. Let me summarize them. So you have the original political, okay? You break off kind of culture. So you have the religion and state.
Religion, politics, and language.
There's then the techno-economic production, right? Is that and science? So
that's right.
is that basically the 4? Okay,
right.
And these then are the minimum waves of a society that are operating in some sort of frequency in relationship to another. And then there's an international relational structure. As we have a global event, then that's creating particular kinds of waves. And World System 3.0 is tracking exactly what those waves are. And this is the minimum ingredients for it.
Exactly. And so this is the whole layer of macro waves that stand on top of what you talk about.
Yep.
Basically, where you're talking about it from the micro up and building the foundations and levels of human behavior and consciousness. And well, I'm not even going to say consciousness because that's a contentious word, but just,
human behavior is fine. We'll just stay with behavior. That's a pretty reasonable and ambiguous word. I'll take it.
Right. Whereas my model is institutional behavior.
Exactly.
And so what we basically do is say is like, if you were to put institutional behavior with human behavior, you would have a complete ontology of the social sciences.
Actually, let's double click on that, brother, because that's exactly, I say that in one of my 2003 papers. I'm like, okay, I think I delineated the foundation for social sciences. If you could add exactly what you said, this institutional behavioral pattern, if we could get the ontology of that right, then we could actually clap with 2 hands from the bottom of human behavior in psychology and the cultural, oral indigenous stuff, working together, social relations. And then we build these technological civilization stuff. And then we have, and I think you used the word magistrates at some point. Maybe we can bring that word in. Have these different institutionalized magistrates in different configurations across international relations. And it's about getting that system, those behavioral analyses, micro and macro together, that affords a social science that's up to the task. So I love the sound of that.
And most importantly, we're just basically saying this is the new ontological canon or body of knowledge. So you would say a practitioner who says, I aspire to be a social scientist. Where do I start? The very first thing and the very last thing you would talk about in your career are these ontologies. So in the first part of your career, you start by learning from an ontological perspective before you get into epistemology and messy mechanisms and methodologies and all this other stuff. And so like you should start with this sort of thing. Would be like Henriques and Ryan, would teach you the foundations. Then you would go on and do your individual investigations. As you return to a doctoral pursuit, you would start again with reviewing whether or not we know these structures need to be updated. So maybe we're on Universal Theory of Knowledge 2.1. And so basically, what's the state when the student enters the program? And then again, they would go back to their specialty and focus on whatever it is that they were doing. But it would always have a interoperability map so that anyone doing anything in social sciences would know where they were standing. You are here.
Totally.
And when you finish that work, here's the model that will basically be updated.
Exactly. Actually, a minor point, the U in UTOK actually is unified. So rather than universal, but similar. And actually, no, it's fine. But I'll just make a note because it's exactly related to your point. It comes off of E.O. Wilson's consilience. I tie it, which is unity of knowledge and a whole big picture of the whole knowledge. So universal is close to that. But the point that I'm after is, and this is the whole wave that we're talking about in the shift of paradigm, is like, what the fuck is the big picture coherence? Right. That, and unified is another word for sort of people that care about unified knowledge are focused more on coherence at some level, the coherence of the model and the interface with correspondence rather than specific correspondence, which is more empirical, traditional methodological based science. So it's like, whoa, how does the whole inner logic of the system work? What are the various interrelated pieces? Is there an interior logic? And then do you get a macroscopic mapping to the territory with the map? And then you get, that's the coherence criteria, and a unified affords a comprehensive and clear, intelligible placement of the specifics. And so exactly what you're describing is exactly what I'd hope for. You'd be like, oh, I know where I am in the map. And maybe the macroscopic map will, of course, need to be evolved and updated and be like, this was wrong. And maybe it's 2.0 now. And that's the nature, but it's that dialectical tension of specific and macro and affording people good locations in their world human systems frame.
That's right. That's right. And one of the mistakes of the early big model people, to come back to the beginning of our conversation.
Beautiful. I like the cycle.
They didn't play well with the others. They didn't build interoperable models. In fact, they were at war.
Yes.
And more to the point, they were doing that because they were pushing certain what I would say biased or simplified models with, say, we're only looking at one epistemology and the others are wrong.
Totally.
It's things like that. And so it was a war of epistemology as much as anything. But also the problem was that they did not understand how to create an open system model that was not so egotistical. Everyone wanted to own it. It's like, it's mine.
Right. And it needs to dominate, right? My nation needs to win. It's like, no, actually, we need to get trans-egoic, trans-justificatory. You have to understand the position that you're aspectualizing. And then rather those other people are going to aspectualize different things. You get harmonics across that. Then you can see what I talk about, see the elephant sun god, which is look at the biggest thing through lots of perspectives with an integrated pluralistic view. And I think that's the sensibility that's emerging.
That's right. And so you're always going to have pluralist big models. You're never. It's sort of like how the military has two of everything. The famous scene in Armageddon where they take up the two different drills and the one breaks and they're like, aha, we knew that was going to happen. They basically gave us 15 freaking clues that was going to happen. But the whole joke was like, you've got to have multiple tools no matter what. And that's true for complex systems. Right. And so when you're trying to understand a complex system, you could never say that, oh, well, my tool is 86% correlated with reality. Your tool is also 86% correlated with reality. Interestingly enough, sometimes in specific instances, mine is the better tool. Sometimes yours is the better tool.
Right.
And that's so like in a NP incomplete problem, like basically talk about calculative. All you can do is get the closest fit. There's no perfect.
Totally. And so I've learned that over time. Certainly, you have a big picture model and you have to learn the ego. And then thankfully I'm a clinician, so I at least get to show myself in the mirror and be like, yeah, there's your goddamn ego. So at least you see it. And then the evolution.
Because you have to
got to have a little ego to do this. You got to have a little bit of hubris and challenge people. They got to have that. But what I've found over the years is sort of like, okay, I'm an American clinical psychologist. I say this on Bard's List all the time. It's like, I'm an American clinical psychologist, which means I'm aspectualizing certain features of the system of science and justification and tradition that I grew up in, which is great in certain aspects and unbelievably blind in others, right. And the emergent system, big picture, emerges out of my aspectualizing certain features of the big picture. And as a function of that, it gets certain things right. And it absolutely needs complementary perspectives on Zoroastrianism from Bard's perspective and world systems perspectives, right? From in relationship to the industrial, international, historical relations at the global level and then physics and everything else. And if we can afford ourselves that capacity to transcend the narrowness of inside your justification, having it be perfect and then only working, but to an interloping system of sophistication and integrated pluralism, well, then I think we'll be able to find knowledge systems that actually are up to the task as we head into the back half of the 21st century.
Yeah. And one of the keys of that is basically not trying to always reinvent the wheel when you're building a grand model. And so a really good grand model starts with a literature review and meta-analysis. It does not start with,
Right. You got to be inside a particular literature in particular and know it and then construct it that way and then read a hell of super broadly.
because you'll make all the same armchair mistakes that the other greats made when they first started. And so you got to stand on the shoulders of giants and be humble. Right. And then you also have to realize that your life work, almost as soon as you're done it, is going to start aging. And so you have to have the humility to know that your role was to create a step or a structure that could then keep the conversation going.
Love it. Love it. I often talk about passing the baton of energy information down the road. Okay. Right. It's like, I got it. I can advance it. And it sure as hell ain't the whole goddamn picture. So somebody else going to pick it up and advance it. So, hey, this was really good. Is there anything about World Systems 3.0 we didn't see, or any horizon stuff as you look to the future and, as optimistic or areas of concern or hopes for you in terms of the development of this worldview World Systems 3.0?
Yeah, there's two big points I wanted to make to wrap it up. The first one is to say, let me tell you the four phases we're in and where we're shifting.
Please, yeah.
And then the really big punchline is that I see a fifth wave coming, basically, or a shift in the structure. And we haven't had one of those since the 1690s. So
fasten your seatbelt, folks.
Exactly. When the techno economy became an independent institutional structure from the state. Which spun off basically in England, Sweden, Netherlands, that part of the world first, and then other places where it became separable structures like the stock market, the insurance markets, and all that other stuff, justifying economics as its own language. Okay. So anyway, where are we? So the postmodern wave, 1940-ish to 2020-ish.
Yep.
We're all kind of like well over all the critiques of postmodernism, and we're all ready to move on to the next thing. So it's just a matter of laying the track down.
Yep.
And so the debate is metamodernism the answer? Or is it transmodernism? Or is it transhumanism? Or is it posthumanism? And so there's various different camps. And the task of answering that is to say, what cultural paradigm are we in? And why would we predict that? Well, most of the other people I see in the metamodern space are predicting themselves with only 2 or 3 waves deep. They're basically saying, look, here's modernity, postmodernity, and then us. And when you do it that way, you think that metamodernity is just the folding of the two in a non-dual state. Okay? So you just say modernity, postmodernity, non-dual version of that, metamodernity. That would be the assumption that the way that history always progressed is some sort of non-dual integration. I'm making the claim that no, we started there. It doesn't progress that way. That is the reset button. In fact, non-dualism is the reset button where we try to create stability, not change. It is when we try to say, stop. We do not want the world changing so fast in so many directions. We want to declutter and recenter and find a calm, and everyone wants to meditate and put everything in alignment and get their chakras in order and all that stuff. And that's not new. That's the very dawn of civilization. We've been there before. And so we're in one of those phases. Okay. One of the dangers of those phases is that you do have a little bit of a power swing. And so the feudal period was one of those phases. It was a non-dual phase where everything reintegrated into the Lord and manor, and the religion and the state started creeping together, and economics we're getting really tight. And basically the way it works is everything's really harmonious inside the system, but there's no challengers and there's no balance of power. So China is doing this. And so if China were to, on the current trajectory, were to win the future, they would be instituting a globalist, non-dualist culture with China at the center. Okay.
Right. Yep.
That would be a cultural hegemony. Okay. Going back to the world systems model. Would we predict a cultural hegemony in China? Probably only if they were the center of both science and technology. Guess what? It's not how Asia works. It's a triangle. The East Asia has been a historical triangle of Japan, Korea, and China. It has also been a historical triangle of multiple religions. It has also been a historical triangle on all these. Basically, the Chinese system is not China alone. It's the entire East Asian system. Okay. When China is dominant culturally, and it becomes this integrated system and structure. When rivalry picks up between Japan and Korea and so forth, it actually challenges that. So you would say, well, if Korea and Japan are serious challengers to China in any way, they might be able to disrupt that sort of integrative pattern. Okay. Yep. That's just one way to analyze it.
One way to think about it.
China versus India, right? So you can analyze that dynamic. So there's a lot, or Europe, so there's a lot of these different triangulations you have to make these predictions. So it gets messy. Not I bet. But the short answer is this: only if the new hegemon succeeds in creating this non-dualistic kind of global culture, we would say that's our paradigm. Okay. So metamodernism doesn't actually become the global paradigm in my model unless it's embodied as the hegemonic force. Okay. So it's not enough that a few people in, art circles in the Netherlands and, California love it. It's got to be, legitimized. Yep. So we could be 80 years out from a time period where that is the case. And if that is the correct prediction, then the metamodern paradigm as described by the integral folks are correct. The non-dualist analysis where we go modernism, postmodern, metamodern. What if you take a longer harmonic, you see a different pattern, more powerful. So the older the harmony, the more powerful. I said that at the beginning of the video. So if we were to see a harmony that was like, that's not enough cycles of analysis to understand the future, then that would be the wrong interpretation of what's going to happen. And so let's say we go back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and say, we are still in the industrial era. We're still in the industrial era. That's the anchor point. And so all cycles must originate there until we leave that era. You see? Okay. So just like emergence at any stage, we're still there until we create a new system where that's no longer the harmony pattern. Okay. My claim is we're still in that era still. And people are a little jumping the gun and saying that we're in a new era. Why am I saying that? We don't have a fifth structure yet. So as long as we got the same structure, we're in the same wave harmonics, we're stuck and anchored from the first industrial paradigm. Guess what? I'm the only one who actually has an explanatory argument here. Ask them how they actually justify their model. They don't know. They don't know how it works. They just modern, postmodern, the next thing, Hegelian, and that's as far as we go. So my theory is that we need to go back all the way to the beginning, and that means there's 4 waves we need to take into consideration since then in culture, and that would be it goes the liberal period, then the modern period, then the postmodern period, then the meta, and the period, and the older harmonic, the traditional harmonic behind that is the traditionalist society that is often mentioned in some other people's work. But they skip the liberal period. Lena skips it. And this is critical that Lena skips this. The 80-year period, the liberal period, is where both of the great magisteria of our times were invented, the techno-economic and the scientific. And so to skip that harmonic is to basically miss the most important root action that we've been living in since the 1600s. And so adding that back in the model, I'm going to come up with a different interpretation of metamodernism than they do. So I'm not going to have time to get into it in this video, but that's a cliffhanger.
Well, it's a cliffhanger. We get it right to the edge, and then we'll see. No, it's beautiful.
Right. And then I'll not go into any depth with the other 3. Okay. We already said we're going from the digital, from the 5th techno-economic, and the 6th that we're crossing over right now is you can call it either the green or organic. I prefer organic because that's the description of the technology and the type of design logics. Okay. Green is like a political statement. So basically, we are entering that emergence period of that paradigm, and we have all the trajectories to prove it in terms of solar, in terms of quantum, and so forth. The third one, the political, is a 50-year shift. And this is like, there's a couple of major models that I integrated for this, and every political science person knows them. I'm not going to explain it right now, but there's a sort of a liberal conservative harmonic pattern every 25 years. And then there's basically what you call basically the foreign versus domestic harmonic every 50-ish years. So you get this cycle like this, where basically you go around a quadrant of like domestic versus foreign, or conservative versus progressive dominance. And so as we're going around that cycle again, we're coming up among the emergent swing. So we're shifting into a new political paradigm. Okay, political, technological, cultural, all happening now. And the fourth one, scientific. Well, that's also happening now, because that's the except for that's on a half harmonic, because it emerged 40 years ago. So that's the stabilizing force, because it's the oldest harmonic. And so basically the complexity paradigm is stabilizing the others. And therefore, any one of those other paradigms that doesn't start with complexity as their base are making the same error that I said Lin is making. You always have to start with the oldest harmonic as being your base. And so complexity first. So we are in a complexity dominant era that also has a meta-modern push, which we are not defining correctly yet because we're misreading the tea leaves. And then we also have this this green swing or organic swing.
Organic,
right? And so you have all these stacks. Okay. Well, the thing is, we haven't had a stack this deep since the first industrial revolution, which is a signal of what? The end of that era, because they're all coming back around to basically the same level of intensity that we had when we created the liberal paradigm, the first industrial revolution, the political shift from colonialism, and like all happening at the same time. So over the next 40 years, we're playing out, yes, the same level of intensity change as the liberal period.
All right.
So that's why I say we are actually in a neoliberal period rather than a meta-modern period.
Meta-modern, okay. So it's a second.
We should already know that, because that's what everyone's whining about.
Yeah.
Right? So why aren't we just telling the truth and saying meta-modernism is the reaction to the liberal dominant, the neoliberal dominance? So I'm working on the definition of how to work this out, because that's the political term, neoliberal. But basically, we need a better term. And Michelle Bowens is arguing for, he likes transmodernism instead.
Right, I know.
Because it implies a more open or liberal behavior. Yeah. And meta is much more rigid because it implies frames on top of frames on top of frames.
Okay.
So if the meta people are right, we're going into this non-dualist, heavy frame, heavy gem-like, rigid structure emanating out of China. And if the more neoliberal, or what I would call the decentralization argument, is correct, which is what Bowens and I are talking about, we are triggering an opening for a new institutional structure, rather than just a re-entrenchment of these other four into a right. And so as this window opens, a fifth structure will be born, and we call it right now the Commons Magisteria.
Love it. Okay,
so
fascinating.
That was the big idea.
Right.
So
there it is. The fifth opens up.
Exactly. So when you have a door that opens in terms of harmonics now history could go otherwise. The events have to occur. Of course. So the events have to occur to create the Magistery of the Commons. Otherwise, it's a missed window. And guess what? We are going back to a rigid, integrated system. But if the window of opportunity is seized and we produce a fifth structure that we haven't had yet in the international system, that fifth structure will then create a new sort of leveling up of everything at once, which would be really nice, because we could kind of use that. We're running up against the wall here, and that leveling is surrounding the environment. And so everyone can put two and two together and say, our biggest wall is our biggest opportunity, which is a institutional structure around the two kinds of energy and data, right? One, basically the environment, essentially, and data being the human data, the world data problem.
Beautiful.
Digital twins and all that good stuff.
Love it. And so, yeah, that's a very nice summary, I think, of what World Systems 3.0 brings us in the framing of that. Certainly, there's lots of conversations for us to have. We're running out of time, so because we said we try to narrow it.
Oh, yeah. Putting a period on it, like,
please.
My whole point is, I'm not being cocky about this because I think I'm smarter than other people. It's nothing like that. I'm being cocky about it just simply because the scientist with the deepest explanation and the strongest predictive model, who can tell you exactly why it's more predictive, is going to win the argument. And my claim is that the people who are trying to tell us what these paradigms are, complexity and metamodern or whatever these global paradigms are, if they're not using the right heuristics for defining them, they're getting them wrong. Like I just said, in terms of metamodernism, basically maybe guessing the wrong direction. We're at this point, right?
Yep.
Does it go like this or does it go off to infinity? I said.
Right. So. Yeah. No, I think you laid that case out very nicely. And I look forward to our continued conversations. The shorthand from the tree of knowledge is, hey, we're going to go through the fifth joint point here, and the fundamental reason is the 20th century lays down an information novel, global, connected information network, builds artificial intelligence systems that upgrade technology so it starts interfacing with our human intellect, the intelligence digital dynamic. And then when we lay that down and that grows out of infrastructure, that's an entirely new potential for a complex adaptive plane of existence. And that's going to change fucking enormously.
Bart calls that system attentionalism and sensocracy. And I say yes, but that's an interim step to me until you actually have a commons that separates the sensocracy from the other systems.
That's why I look forward to us to dialoguing about the various kinds of domains and also this concept of magistrate, which we didn't pick up on, but maybe sometime either just privately, we'll put it up on the web, have another UTOKing, whatever. But the bridge between what this thing of justification systems that I grabbed a hold of, as the fundamental organizer of capital C culture, and then what that does at the human behavior level relative to technological interface and the energy information flows. There's a lot of good shit for us to mine going forward. I really look forward to seeing what evolves in relationship to that kind of synergy and difference. And it's fascinating. It's just a beautiful time for me. It's like, oh my God, look where we are, people.
Yeah, it's great because, and like these things are coming together as we talk to each other. As Michelle and I talk to each other, we came to the conclusion that his models and my models, our interests were convergent. Alexander Bard, his arguments about attentionalism and so forth, although the main difference between him and me is that if you were to stress syntheos as being the dominant concept, you would be arguing that the cultural paradigm is in ascendance. So you would basically say that culture, as opposed to these other economic, scientific, and political systems, religion is in the cultural paradigm. So if we create a new God and that really happens, whoosh, it becomes dominant. And so now our world system is going to be driven by a global religion, essentially. If that would be the extreme case.
Sure.
But that would be an alternative scenario than the creation of a fifth magisteria.
No, and that's what we're all super excited. We're on the edge of this thing. Everyone's throwing stuff in there, wondering we'll see what happens. And I hope that the general sentiment that we'll learn from the past and an integrated pluralistic attitude and Zoom world and other digital technologies afford us to get together and connect. And I love the idea of an emergent wisdom commons magistrate that ties us together and affords us sort of a new international relational space to grow into. So it's a beautiful vision. And I really appreciate you coming. And
I think it's really important
laying out for me.
We make this common knowledge. Basically, it's all about taking, these are the systems of knowledge of the upper class. These are not just theories. These are the actual systems of knowledge that the upper class have been using all along. Okay. And so what we're really kind of doing is doing the Promethean trick, and we're stealing fire from the upper class education and saying, here's what we've been hiding all along in plain sight, which gives us a model of social phenomenon, which explains why they can always outpredict everything that we're doing.
Right. Well, we can steal the culture, steal the fire, and then build our own going into the next. All right, friend.
Build a commons that works.
Build a commons that affords it. That's the vision. I love that.
That's what we're trying to do.
All right. Love it. We'll talk to Michelle Bounds and all that. So, all right, folks, I think this brings it to a close. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your passion and your vision. It's really fascinating. And I look forward to circling back in.
I look forward to getting deeper into the harmonics between your work and mine. Definitely.
Brilliant. All right, friend. Wonderful.